The silence was the heaviest thing John left behind, heavier than the mortgage payment book with its final page stamped "paid in full," heavier than the cast-iron anvil in the corner of the workshop. It was a thick, woolly silence that filled the spaces he used to occupy, the worn spot on the linoleum in front of the sink, the driver's seat of the Farmall M, the empty side of the bed. It had been a week since they'd put him in the ground up on the hill overlooking the north pasture, and the silence was only getting louder. Sarah Miller stood on the back porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she had no intention of drinking. The morning sun was just clearing the top of the Oak Ridge, painting the dew-soaked alfalfa field in strokes of gold and green. 23 Holstein cows, their black and white hides gleaming, were making their slow, deliberate way out to that same pasture. They were John's girls, his pride. Now they were hers. All 23 of them, and the 80 acres of rolling Wisconsin land they stood on. The crunch of gravel broke the morning's fragile peace. A brand-new forest-green Chevrolet pickup, shiny enough to signal it was a town truck, not a farm truck, rolled up the lane and parked next to John's rust-pocked Ford F-100. The driver's side door opened and out stepped Walt Peterson. He was a big man, soft in the middle, who farmed the 300 acres bordering her property to the west. He took off his seed corn cap, ran a hand through his thinning hair, and put it back on, a gesture he probably thought looked thoughtful and sympathetic. It just looked rehearsed. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low boom that always seemed to take up too much air. "Terrible business about John, just terrible. A good man." She just nodded, her jaw tight. She didn't invite him up on the porch. Walt didn't seem to notice or care. His eyes weren't on her, they were scanning the property, lingering on the barn with its faded red paint and the 2 tractors parked under the lean-to. He was appraising, calculating. "Look, I know it's soon," he began, shifting his weight. "But a woman alone. This is a lot to handle. The milking, the haying. It's a 2-man job, and that's on a good day." Sarah's grip on the mug tightened. She could feel the heat through the ceramic now. "I'm managing." He gave a soft, condescending chuckle. "For now. But what happens when that old Farmall of John's throws a rod? Or the baler goes down in the middle of July? I was talking to the fellas down at the PCA office. They're offering fantastic rates right now, favorable terms. I just picked up the quarter section south of me. Put in a new harvestor silo last fall. You gotta expand to survive these days, Sarah. Economies of scale." She knew what was coming. It was the same talk John had complained about for the last 5 years. The gospel of "get big or get out," preached by bankers in cheap suits and sung by farmers who measured their worth in acres and horsepower, not in the blackness of their ledger. "I'm not selling, Walt." Her voice was flat, cold as a well chain in January. He finally looked at her, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Be realistic. You can't run a dairy, even a small one like this, with that museum collection." He gestured with his chin toward the lean-to. John's tractors. The 1951 Farmall M, its red paint faded to a dull orange, was the main workhorse. It was simple, strong, and completely paid for. Next to it was the little John Deere Model A, the Johnny Popper that they used for raking hay and other light chores. Its distinctive 2-cylinder engine was a sound as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "That museum collection put food on our table and paid this farm off free and clear," she said, the words sharp enough to cut. "Which is more than you can say for that brand new John Deere 4430 you've got financed up to the headlights." Walt's face flushed a deep red. He had paraded that tractor all over the county when he bought it, the first one around with an enclosed cab and air conditioning. He'd made a special point of driving it past their place, giving John a wave from his climate-controlled bubble while John was sweating in the open air on the M. "That's progress, Sarah," he snapped, his sympathetic act gone. "It's about leverage, using the bank's money to make more money. It's the modern way. You're stuck in the past with John's old ideas. This place will bleed you dry in a year. I'm making you a fair offer. A good offer. More than it's worth, considering the state of the equipment." She set her mug down on the railing with a loud clink. "The equipment works, and the only thing that's going to bleed me dry is listening to you. The answer is no, Walt. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. This is my home. John and I built it. I'm not leaving. He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working. He saw the iron in her eyes and knew he was beaten for the day. He shook his head, a look of pity mixing with his anger. Don't say I didn't warn you, he muttered, turning back to his shiny truck. He climbed in, slammed the door, and spun his tires in the gravel as he left, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over everything, a fine layer of grit and disrespect. Sarah watched until his taillights disappeared down the road. The silence that rushed back in was different this time. It wasn't empty anymore. It was charged. The low morning sun cast her shadow long and thin across the yard, pointing like a compass needle toward the barn, toward the cows, toward the work. Walt's words, meant to scare her, had done the opposite. They had burned away the fog of her grief and left behind a hard, clear purpose. He saw a helpless widow. He saw outdated machines and a failing farm. He was wrong. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of how she proved him and everyone else wrong, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever had someone look you in the eye and tell you that you couldn't do something? That your way was old-fashioned and bound to fail? Have you ever had your dream or your life's work dismissed as a lost cause? Let me know down in the comments, because that doubt, that condescending pity from men like Walt Peterson, became the pure high-octane fuel that burned in Sarah Miller's heart from that day forward. Her first test came sooner than she expected. It was late June, the air thick and sweet with the smell of cut alfalfa. The first cutting of hay was the most important. It was the highest in protein, the stuff that would keep the milk flowing strong through the winter. She was in the north field, the one that sloped gently down to the creek, on the Farmall M, pulling the old New Holland 461 haybine. The machine was a marvel of 60s engineering. It cut the hay with a sickle bar and ran it through a set of rubber rollers that crimped the stems, allowing them to dry faster. The M was running like a top, its four-cylinder engine singing a steady, powerful rhythm. Sarah loved the feel of it, the direct connection to the ground, the smell of diesel and hot metal. She wasn't sealed in a glass box like Walt Peterson. She was part of the work, feeling the sun on her neck and the breeze on her face. She was halfway through the field, laying down perfect, fluffy windrows when the sound changed. The steady whirring and clattering of the haybine was interrupted by a loud metallic bang, followed by a violent, shuddering vibration that she felt all the way up through the tractor seat. She immediately stomped on the clutch and pulled the lever to disengage the PTO shaft. The silence that followed was terrifying. She climbed down from the tractor, her heart sinking into her boots. She walked back to the haybine, already dreading what she'd find. The problem was obvious. The whole sickle bar, the long-toothed blade that did the cutting, was sitting dead still. The drive mechanism, a heavy cast-iron gearbox, often called a wobble box, was hot to the touch and ominously quiet. She knelt in the cut alfalfa, the sharp stubble pressing into her knees, and peered underneath the safety shield. It was worse than she thought. The main drive arm that connected the gearbox to the sickle head had sheared clean off. A thick steel pin had snapped, and the force had cracked the housing of the wobble box itself. It was a catastrophic failure. A wave of cold panic washed over her. This wasn't a simple fix, not like changing a broken sickle knife section. This was major surgery. Without this machine, she couldn't make hay. If she couldn't make hay, she'd have to buy it all winter, an expense that would cripple her. She could hire a custom operator, but that was expensive too, and they always did their own fields first, meaning hers would likely get rained on. Just then, as if summoned by her despair, she heard the throaty roar of a big diesel engine. Walt Peterson was on his side of the fence line, pulling a massive Heston stackhand, a machine that didn't make bales, but instead compressed the hay into 1,000-pound loaves. He slowed his big John Deere to a crawl, looking over at her stranded in the middle of her field. He didn't wave. He just gave a slow, knowing shake of his head and throttled his tractor back up, leaving her in a cloud of his dust and exhaust. The message was clear. I told you so. Rage, hot and pure, burned through her panic. She would not be beaten, not by a broken piece of steel, and certainly not by the smug satisfaction of her neighbor. She marched back to the tractor, her stride full of purpose, and drove it and the broken haybine back to the farmstead. That evening, the barn was lit by a single bare bulb hanging from a cord, casting long, dancing shadows. The air was thick with the smell of old grease and cold iron. Armed with John's heavy-duty socket set and a collection of pry bars, Sarah went to war with the wobble box. Every bolt was rusted tight, sealed by years of dirt and pressure. She soaked them in penetrating oil, the acrid smell stinging her nostrils. She put a long pipe on the end of a breaker bar for extra leverage, her muscles straining, her knuckles scraping raw against the machine's frame. Hours passed. The moon rose high over the barn. The night insects chirped a steady rhythm. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, the last bolt broke free. The gearbox was heavier than she'd imagined, a good 70 pounds of dead weight. She wrestled it off its mounting and onto the concrete floor with a heavy thud. Covered in grease and sweat, her body aching, she stared down at the broken piece of machinery. It looked hopeless. The next morning she loaded the busted gearbox into the back of the Ford pickup and started making calls. The New Holland dealer in town just laughed. "A 461? Lady, we haven't been able to get parts for that wobble box in 10 years. Your best bet is a salvage yard." The first 2 salvage yards were a bust, acres of rusting farm equipment, picked over and sun-bleached. No New Holland haybines of that vintage. The men running the places gave her the same look as Walt, a mixture of pity and amusement. "Little lady, maybe you should just call a custom operator." She was feeling the first real tendrils of despair creeping in when she remembered a place John had mentioned once. Old Man Hemlock's, he'd called it. Not a real salvage yard, but a farm where the owner never threw anything away. It was a long shot. She found the place 20 miles down a dusty back road. The farm was a chaotic landscape of mechanical dinosaurs. Dozens of tractors, combines, and implements sat in silent, rusting rows, slowly being consumed by weeds and wildflowers. An old man with a long white beard and overalls so stained they looked like wood grain emerged from a shed. It was Hemlock. "Looking for something?" he rasped, wiping his hands on a rag. "A wobble box. For a New Holland 461 haybine," Sarah said, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. Hemlock stroked his beard, his eyes distant. 461, yeah, good machine. Got one out back of the corn crib. Hasn't run in a decade. Engines seized, but the rest of her should be sound." He led her through a maze of metal to a faded, weed-choked haybine that looked even worse than hers. But the wobble box was intact. "I'll take it," she said, her heart soaring. $100, Hemlock said. It was more money than she wanted to spend, but it was a fraction of what a custom operator would cost. They used a chain hoist hanging from a thick oak branch to lift the heavy gearbox into the back of her truck. As she was about to leave, Hemlock put a greasy hand on her truck door. "That Peterson fella was in here last week," he said, his voice low, "asking if I had any parts for a 461. Said his neighbor's was about to break down and she'd be forced to sell to him. Told him I didn't have a thing." He gave her a wink, his eyes twinkling under his bushy brows. "Good luck, girl. Give 'em hell." That night, fueled by coffee and the old man's kindness, Sarah worked tirelessly. Cleaning the salvage yard part, swapping over a few fittings from her old one, wrestling the heavy beast back into position. Lining up the bolt holes was a nightmare. She used a hydraulic jack and blocks of wood to nudge it into place, a millimeter at a time. Finally, just as the eastern sky began to turn from black to grey, the last bolt was tightened. She hooked the PTO shaft back up, her hands trembling with exhaustion and anticipation. She climbed onto the farmall's iron seat, took a deep breath, and started the engine. It rumbled to life. Slowly, carefully, she eased the PTO lever. The shaft began to turn. There was a clunk, a whir, and then the beautiful rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the sickle bar slicing through the air. It worked. She sat there for a full minute, listening to the sound of her victory, tears of relief and exhaustion tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. The sun was just coming up. The hay was still dry. She still had a chance. She put the tractor in gear and drove back out to the field she had abandoned, ready to finish the job. The years that followed settled into a rhythm of hard work and quiet progress. The mid-1970s were a boom time for American agriculture. The massive grain sales to the Soviet Union had sent commodity prices through the roof. The government was encouraging farmers to borrow money, to expand. to plant every available inch of soil to feed the world. Land prices soared, the mood in the Farm Belt was electric, a gold rush mentality fueled by easy credit and soaring optimism. Walt Peterson was the poster child for this new era. He was no longer just a neighbor, he was becoming an empire builder. He used his rapidly inflating land values as collateral to borrow more and more money from the Production Credit Association. He bought another 80 acres, then another 160. His farm swelled to over 600 acres. He tore down old fence rows, bulldozed grassy waterways, and planted corn and soybeans right up to the gravel on the town road. A second massive cobalt blue harvester silo went up next to the first, gleaming in the sun like a monument to his ambition. His machinery lineup became a rolling John Deere dealership. The 4430 was traded in for a new 4640, a true beast of a tractor with dual rear wheels and a cab so plush it looked like the cockpit of an airplane. He bought a 6-row corn planter, a brand new Gleaner combine. He was the talk of the co-op, the man everyone pointed to as a model of success. He was making money hand over fist, and he wasn't shy about it. His new pickup was a top-of-the-line Silverado, and his wife drove a brand-new Buick sedan into town. Meanwhile, Sarah Miller's farm looked, to the outside world, like a relic trapped in amber. She watched Walt's expansion with a growing sense of unease. She heard the same siren song of easy credit and endless growth that was intoxicating the rest of the county. But in her ears, it sounded like John's voice, a low whisper of caution. Debt is a landlord you can never get rid of, Sal. He's always there, demanding his rent, rain or shine, good prices or bad. So she resisted. While her neighbors were at the bank signing loan papers, she was in her barn with her herd record books. The extra money she made from the strong milk prices didn't go toward new iron or more land. It went into a savings account at the local bank and into improving what she already owned. She became a student of dairy genetics. She spent her evenings poring over bull catalogs from American Breeders' Service, studying pedigrees and production numbers. She invested in semen from top-quality Holstein sires, carefully breeding her cows to produce daughters that were stronger, healthier, and gave more milk. It was a slow, patient process. She kept every promising heifer calf, raising them with meticulous care. Her herd began to grow, not by purchase, but by birth. 23 cows became 30, 30 became 38. By the end of 1975, 3 years after John's death, she was milking 46 cows, double what she had started with. Each and every one of them was born on the farm, and each and every one was paid for. She didn't buy more land, she made her own land better. She took soil samples and worked with the county extension agent, developing a fertilization plan that boosted her alfalfa yields. She rotated her pastures, which improved the grass and reduced her feed costs. Her milk production per cow climbed steadily, far surpassing the county average. She was making more money off her 80 acres than many farmers were making off twice that much. But nobody saw that. All they saw was the old Farmall M, still puffing a little blue smoke as it chugged its way across the fields. They saw the faded red barn, not the high-producing herd inside it. They saw her mended overalls and work-worn hands, not the healthy bank balance she was quietly building. The talk at the feed mill was always the same. Poor Sarah, she's getting left behind. She's too scared to take a risk. You gotta risk it for the biscuit. Walt Peterson offered her a good price years ago. She should have taken it. Look at him now. Walt himself treated her with an air of benign pity. He'd drive by in his massive air-conditioned tractor and give her a little wave, the kind you give a child. He saw her on her old open-station Farmall, covered in dust and sweat, and he saw a failure, a woman clinging to the past while he was building the future. He didn't see a competitor, he saw a peasant. And that was the biggest mistake he ever made. One crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah was at the bank in town, depositing her milk check. The lobby was busy, filled with farmers in seed corn hats, talking loudly about yields and land prices. As she waited in line, she overheard the bank's main loan officer, a man named Mr. Abernathy, talking to another farmer. The prime rate ticked up another quarter point this morning, Abernathy said, his voice a little tight. The Fed chairman is making some serious noise about whipping inflation. We're having to move all our new operating loans to a variable rate." The farmer scoffed. "A few points here or there. What's the difference when corn is $4 a bushel?" Abernathy just gave a thin, worried smile. The word sent a chill down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Variable rate, inflation. She didn't understand all the financial jargon, but she understood the tone in the banker's voice. It was the sound of a man who knew the sunny weather was about to change. She looked around the bustling bank lobby at the confident, smiling faces of her neighbors, all of them leveraged to the hilt, all of them betting on the boom to last forever. A cold, hard knot formed in the pit of her stomach. The sky was blue and the harvest was bountiful, but for the first time she could see a storm gathering on the distant horizon, a storm that most people didn't even know existed. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that when it finally hit, it wasn't going to matter how big your tractor was. All that would matter was how much you owed the bank. The end of the 70s arrived not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding squeeze. It started on the television news, with somber men in Washington talking about inflation and interest rates. Then it came in the mail, in letters from the bank, with new, higher numbers on the loan statements. For most farmers in the county, it was just background noise, static that couldn't possibly interfere with the music of $4 corn and rising land values. But Sarah heard it. It was the sound of the vice tightening. The first visible crack in Walt Peterson's gleaming empire appeared in the summer of 1980. It was a brutally hot and dry July, the kind where the corn leaves curl up by midday, praying for a rain that never comes. The heat shimmered off the county roads in waves, and the air was so still you could hear a screen door slam a mile away. Sarah was cultivating her small patch of corn with the old 2-row cultivator on the Johnny Popper. The little John Deere A's distinctive pop, 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 a comforting rhythm in the oppressive heat. Her corn was suffering like everyone else's, but her costs were low. A bad year would hurt, but it wouldn't break her. Across the fence, Walt's operation was a different story. His 600 acres of corn were a sea of pale green, thirsty and stressed. He was running his massive John Deere 4640 day and night, pulling a center pivot irrigation rig he'd installed the year before, a $1 million gamble on ever-increasing crop prices. The rig was a quarter-mile-long metal serpent, sucking water from a deep well and spraying it over the wilting crop. The diesel engine that ran the pump roared ceaselessly, a desperate, expensive sound that echoed across the valley. One afternoon, the roaring stopped. The silence was so sudden it was jarring. Sarah looked up from her work to see the irrigation rig was motionless. A few minutes later, she saw Walt's Silverado speeding down the field road, kicking up a plume of brown dust. She watched as he got out and stared at the silent pump engine, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. Later that day, the John Deere service truck arrived from town. It stayed for hours. The problem, as she heard later at the feed mill, was a complex fuel injector pump failure. It wasn't something a farmer could fix with a wrench and some grit. It required a specialized technician and a part that had to be overnighted from a warehouse in Moline, Illinois. The bill for the service call and the part, she heard, was over $2,000. The rig was down for 2 full days in the worst of the heat wave. 2 days of burning sun on a thirsty crop. 2 days of watching his investment wither on the stalk. The cracks began to spread. That fall, during soybean harvest, his new Gleaner combine sat idle for the better part of a week. A set of hydraulic sensors on the header height control had failed. Again, the service truck came. Again, there were expensive non-negotiable bills. The perfect, efficient system he had built was proving to be a fragile house of cards. Every component was dependent on the next, and a single $500 electronic part could bring a $100,000 machine to a dead stop. Sarah, meanwhile, harvested her own small fields with the help of a neighbor who still ran an old Alice Chalmers Gleaner E, a simple, reliable machine from the 60s. They traded work. She helped him with his hay. He helped her with her combining. It was the old way. The way of community, not of corporate-style farming. The talk at the feed mill began to change. The swagger was gone, replaced by a low murmur of anxiety. The price of diesel fuel had nearly doubled. Fertilizer costs were through the roof. And the news from Washington was getting worse. The Federal Reserve, under a new chairman named Paul Volcker, had declared all-out war on inflation. He was cranking up interest rates to levels nobody had ever seen before. For farmers like Walt, who had built their empires on variable rate loans, every tick upward was another turn of the screw. His operating loan for that year, which he had taken out at 9%, was suddenly at 15%, then 17%. One day, Sarah saw Walt selling his haying equipment. The big Heston stackhand and the John Deere tractor that pulled it were loaded onto a flatbed trailer. He was selling his beef cattle too. He was liquidating assets, trying to generate cash to service the massive debt on his land and his main line of equipment. The empire was shrinking, pulling back in on itself. He stopped waving when he drove past her place. His face, when she caught a glimpse of it, was pale and drawn. The face of a man who was sleeping poorly, a man who stared at the ceiling at 3 in the morning, listening to the sound of the financial vice groaning as it tightened. The storm she had seen on the horizon was no longer distant. The sky was turning a bruised, ominous purple, and the first cold winds of the crisis had begun to blow. The winter of 1981 was brutal, but the economic winter that followed was far worse. The prime interest rate, the number that governed all the others, hit a staggering 21.5%. It was a death sentence for a generation of farmers who had been told by the government, by the banks, by the universities to borrow and expand. The grain embargo against the Soviet Union had collapsed commodity prices, and now the cost of borrowing money had become astronomical. It was a perfect storm, a brutal convergence of bad policy and bad luck, and it ripped through the American heartland like a tornado. The foreclosure notices started appearing in the county newspaper, small blocks of text in the legal section that announced the death of a family's dream. First one, then 2, then a dozen. These weren't the marginal operators, these were the stars, the progressive farmers who had been featured in the paper just a few years earlier, standing proudly in front of their new silos and giant tractors. An eerie quiet settled over the community. The constant hum of new construction and expansion fell silent, replaced by the grim sound of auctioneers' chants. Farm auctions became the social gatherings of that terrible time. Families and neighbors would stand in the cold November wind on a farmstead that had been in a family for a century, watching as the life's work of their friends was sold off piece by piece to strangers. They came to support the family, to buy a small item as a token, and to bear witness, their faces etched with the terrifying thought, "I could be next." Sarah went to Walt Peterson's auction. She parked her old Ford pickup down the road and walked up the long lane, the same lane Walt's shiny Chevrolet had driven up all those years ago. The place was a ghost of what it had been. The 2 gleaming Harvestor silos stood empty, their bold blue paint already starting to seem like a garish monument to a fallen king. The massive machine shed, once packed with a fleet of green and yellow iron, was nearly empty. The remaining equipment lined up in neat funereal rows in the yard for the bidders to inspect. The crowd was large and somber. Sarah saw Walt standing near the house with his wife, both of them looking small and lost. He had lost weight, and his expensive work coat hung on him. His face was a grey, emotionless mask, but his eyes darted around, flinching every time the auctioneer's rhythmic chant landed on the word sold. He was watching his dream being dismantled, bolt by bolt, dollar by dollar. The big John Deere 4640, his pride and joy, went for less than half of what he still owed on it. The Gleaner combine, the 6-row planter, the massive chisel plow, all sold at devastating losses. The bank would get the proceeds, but it wouldn't be enough. They would still take the land. Sarah didn't bid on anything. She wasn't there to pick at the bones. She stood at the back of the crowd, a silent observer. She felt a profound sadness, but not pity. It was the sorrow of watching a tragedy unfold that had been written years before. Walt hadn't just been arrogant. He had been a true believer in a gospel that had turned out to be a lie. He had worshipped the gods of leverage and expansion, and they had betrayed him. As the auction wound down, she saw Mr. Abernathy, the banker, talking to Walt. It was not a friendly conversation. The banker's face was hard, his gestures sharp. Walt just stood there, taking it, nodding silently. The power dynamic had been brutally, irrevocably reversed. While her neighbors were drowning, Sarah was an island of stability. The price of milk was painfully low, and her income dropped, but her expenses were a tiny fraction of theirs. Her biggest check each month was for the electric bill to run the milking machines. She had no loan payments, no equipment notes. The Farmall M still started every morning, its simple, robust engine indifferent to the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. When a hydraulic line burst, she didn't have to call a service truck. She drove the Ford to the auto parts store, bought a new length of hose and 2 fittings for $10, and fixed it herself in under an hour. Her herd of 46 cows, bred and raised on the farm, produced steadily. Her fields, which she had carefully nourished, gave her all the hay and silage she needed. She bartered with neighbors milk and eggs for a side of pork, her mechanical skills on an old engine in exchange for help fixing a section of roof on the barn. The old ways, the ones Walt had mocked as a museum collection, were now the tools of survival. Her self-sufficiency was her shield, her lack of debt was her fortress. She worked from sunup to sundown, her body often aching with fatigue, but her mind was at peace. She was not afraid. The silence John had left behind was now filled with the steady, reassuring hum of a farm that was truly, completely her own. The auctioneer's voice faded as the last of the small items were sold. The crowd began to disperse, cars and trucks rolling slowly down the lane, leaving the Peterson family alone in the wreckage of their life. Sarah stayed until most everyone was gone. She watched as Walt walked slowly toward the big, empty machine shed, a man adrift. He stepped inside into the shadows and just stood there, staring at the oil stains on the concrete floor where his machines used to be. For the first time, Sarah didn't see an arrogant rival. She saw a broken man, and in that moment, she knew what she had to do. A week after the auction, Sarah drove her Ford pickup down the road and turned into Walt Peterson's lane. The place felt abandoned, the life bled out of it. A large wooden sign with the bank's name on it had been hammered into the ground near the mailbox. The house was still occupied, but it felt temporary. She found Walt out by the empty barn, listlessly nailing a loose board back onto the siding. He looked up as she approached, his eyes hollow. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a weary stoop. He looked a decade older. "Walt," she said, her voice soft. He stopped hammering and leaned against the barn, not meeting her gaze. "Come to say, 'I told you so'?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Go ahead, get it over with. You've earned the right." "No," Sarah said quietly. "I came to make you an offer." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "An offer on what?" "My good name. The bank owns everything, the land, the house, all of it. They're giving us 30 days to get out." "I was at the bank yesterday," she said, ignoring his bitterness. "I talked to Mr. Abernathy. The 80 acres that borders my north pasture, the one your grandfather homesteaded, I bought it." Walt's head snapped up, his eyes widening in disbelief and then narrowing with a fresh wave of humiliation. You bought it? So you can tear down my fences now, plow right up to my barn." The thought of her Farmall M working the land where his 4640 once roared was a final crushing indignity. "No, Walt," she said, her voice firm, cutting through his anger. "I bought it so the bank couldn't sell it to some stranger from out of state. I'm here to offer you a job." He stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "A job?" "I need help," she said simply. "My herd is up to 50 cows now. The haying season is getting to be too much for one person. And that 80 acres needs to be worked. I'll pay you a fair wage, and I've got a tenant agreement drawn up for the house and the barn here. You and your family can stay. Rent is $1 a year. You keep the place up, you can live here as long as you want." Walt was speechless. He leaned his head back against the faded red siding of the barn his grandfather had built, and his composure finally shattered. His shoulders shook, and a single hard sob escaped him. He covered his face with his calloused hands, a man completely undone. Sarah stood there quietly, giving him the dignity of a moment to himself. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. "Why?" he choked out. "After everything I said, everything I did, why would you do this for me?" Sarah looked out across the fields, toward her own farm, a place of order and solvency in a world of chaos. "Because this isn't about being right, Walt," she said. "It's about being neighbors. John always said a farmer's best asset isn't his land or his equipment. It's a good neighbor. You forgot how to be one for a while. I'm giving you a chance to remember." That was the day the war ended. Walt Peterson went to work for Sarah Miller. At first, it was awkward. He, the former titan of modern agriculture, taking orders from the woman he had dismissed as a relic. He felt clumsy and foolish, driving her little Johnny Popper, the simple machine, a constant reminder of his own hubris. But as the seasons turned, something shifted. He rediscovered the satisfaction of fixing a machine with his own hands, of feeling the soil without a layer of glass and steel between him and the earth. He taught Sarah how to weld. She taught him the finer points of dairy genetics. They worked side by side, two solitary figures rebuilding a life out of the rubble of the farm crisis. The community watched, astonished. The story spread through the feed mill and the church basement. Sarah Miller, the quiet widow everyone had pitied, had not only survived, she had prevailed with a kind of grace that was more powerful than any bank loan. She became a legend, not for getting big, but for staying small, for staying smart, for staying solvent. Other farmers, the ones who had managed to hang on by a thread, started stopping by her farm, not to offer pity, but to ask for advice. She'd pour them a cup of coffee at her kitchen table and talk to them about managing costs, about improving what they had instead of borrowing for more, about the simple, profound wisdom of living within your means. Years passed. The 1980s gave way to the 90s. The farm economy slowly healed, but it was a changed world. The scars remained. Walt eventually saved up enough money to buy back his house and the original 40 acres around it from Sarah, paying her exactly what she had paid the bank. They remained neighbors, but now they were friends, their shared history a bond forged in the fires of the crisis. One warm summer evening, long after Walt had retired, Sarah stood on her back porch. She was older now, her hair streaked with grey, her hands permanently shaped by the tools of her trade. The farm was much the same, 80 acres, a herd of 50 high-producing Holsteins, and a barn that was always in need of a fresh coat of paint. The screen door creaked open, and her grandson, a lanky teenager with his grandfather's eyes, came out and stood beside her. He'd been spending the summer on the farm, learning the rhythms of the place. "Grandma," he said, "I was looking at that old M. The engine could use a rebuild, and the transmission is getting noisy. We could trade it in. That dealer in town has a nice used Case IH with a cab and air conditioning. We could probably get a decent loan." Sarah didn't answer right away. She listened to the sounds of the evening, the lowing of the cows in the pasture, the chirping of the crickets, the familiar steady clank of the milking pumps from the barn. The silence John had left was long gone, replaced by the rich, vibrant sounds of a living, breathing farm, a legacy she had saved from the brink. She put her arm around her grandson's shoulders and pointed toward the lean-to, where the old farmall sat, its faded red paint glowing in the last light of the setting sun. "That tractor," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable strength, "is more than just a machine. It's a lesson. It taught me that progress isn't about having the newest and the biggest. It's about owning what you have and understanding how it works. It taught me that the most valuable thing on this farm isn't the land or the cows. It's that." She tapped her temple with her finger. "It's the freedom from fear. That tractor doesn't have air conditioning, but it comes with a good night's sleep. No bank in the world can sell you that." The boy looked at the old tractor, then back at his grandmother's weathered, smiling face, and in the quiet twilight of the Wisconsin evening, he began to understand.